Is this your studio space behind you there? Is that where all the magic happens?
Yeah, I am in that. It's a tiny little room, but yes, this is kind of home. Yeah, most of the days this is where I am. Yeah.
And it looks like you've got like an analog synthesizer behind you there, right?
I actually have quite a lot. I mean, here you can only see part of the room, but on the other side there's actually even more synths. But yeah, on this side it's kind of like a piano, some synths, and like my more the drum stuff is happening in the corner. I have to, since the space is really small, it's really all about what is where. Yeah, I kind of have my little section here. It's computer and more kind of production, and then just the instruments are there. And then on this side, it's like more synth and studio stuff. But yeah, there's quite a lot of instruments for a tiny space, and I always have to juggle what's being used and what needs to go on the shelves and stuff like this. Yeah.
So, what would you say is your biggest creative outlet right now when you're not on tour with somebody else? How are you spending most of your time?
Yeah, I'm spending it here. That's for sure. Like I kind of, even if there's not specifically something in my mind that I want to work on, I kind of come here every day. That's a bit like, of course, there's other stuff happening. We're in Zurich here in Switzerland. I have other stuff. I'm teaching a bit also, but on most days, if it's a free day, I like to spend it here completely. And so that means sometimes specifically working on recording and like producing music. So using software, Ableton, and like kind of creating tracks. But sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's also kind of like research mode where it's like plugging stuff together, trying to improvise with the drums. And sometimes it's more like specifically mixing or doing production. For me or for my projects or for other people, actually, I have more and more requests to kind of like produce tracks with other people, record stuff for other people. I can't really do much crazy drum recording here. It's more of the lo-fi, kind of like two mics on the drums, and kind of go for those more creative kind of recording of drums. And the space is so small and it doesn't sound that great that it's not the best to do full high definition drum recordings. But yeah, it's kind of like working on this weird thing that I'm passionate about these days. It's like this mix between drumming and electronic music and production, I would say.
And do you divide your creative time into drum practice and like composition and other stuff, or is it all kind of one thing? Like you just go in there and create?
Yeah, it's all one thing. Yeah. It's most of the time kind of like, sure, there's a big to-do list of stuff I have to do, and kind of hitting deadlines. But it's usually all one thing. It's not so much. Sometimes I just have an idea of like combining drum with other things, and yeah, it feels my drum practice these days. It's more about experimentation, I would say, just trying out stuff and then finding sounds basically. So it's not so much of a traditional drum practice, I would say.
And when did that change? Because you've obviously gotten a lot of drumistic stuff together that I and people who follow me are still working on, just like the timing, the coordination, the ability to play those kind of prog-ish rhythms. And we can get into that stuff later, but when did you feel like you arrived at a point where you weren't having to spend 5 hours a day or so, like just playing the drums?
It's hard to say. I mean, that's for me like the kind of the craziest part of this journey in music is I have a feeling every couple of years I kind of like reset quite a lot of my expectations and what I'm into and what I want to get deeper in. And so I have a feeling that I had like quite of a crazy start in drumming. I would say I started quite early and I was quite serious about it pretty early also. I guess I was one of those typical kids that were just immediately into drumming and practicing, and so with this and my studies with jazz and playing a lot of drums, I was kind of like so committed to this but it's hard specifically to put like a date because I have a feeling it's kind of been ongoing. It's like a slow shift where all of a sudden you just realize your listening taste. It's a lot about listening actually. It's a lot about what you listen to, what kind of music, and of course I have a feeling that I'm 33 years old. I have a feeling I already had like three major chapters, you know what I mean, in my life, well, of stuff I was into and stuff I'm listening to constantly. And I have a feeling maybe I would say, yeah, I mean, if I have to put a date, 2000, when I was done new school, 2014, 2015, I moved to Berlin. And then kind of during those years, it was like really discovering this electronic music and living it and kind of going out and listening to it a lot. And I feeling probably back then it started this shift of I was always interested in recording and kind of like computer stuff, technology, I would say in general. I was always into trying to understand it. But since then, it was really all of a sudden I was seeing people use it in a way that was super exciting to me. And so I kind of started yeah, I guess focusing on learning a lot about it. So but that it's completely at odds with my outside life because obviously during that time that's when I was touring with Tigran the most, kind of, yeah. So it's this slow crossfade I can see already in my life where whatever I'm doing now and whatever I'm about to do in a couple of years, that's things kind of blend slowly.
That's interesting. From your playing that I've been exposed to, it seems like there are three big strands. And tell me if you agree with this, but one is obviously jazz. I would say another is probably like prog rock. And you can obviously hear a bunch of that stuff in the Tigran playing. And then the third would probably be electronica. But I'm curious about, you said you got an early start with the drums. Who were some of your early teachers and some of your early influences who charted the initial direction for you?
I mean, I started drums when I was 8, and immediately with like immediately studying the drums. My parents. The story really shortly is my parents had a music store, so they didn't have drums there, but they had a music store. So I was kind of exposed to this idea that these jobs exist. By the way, I'm realizing now how crazy it is to be so young and also to be exposed to this idea because a lot of people don't necessarily have this. And so they immediately were putting me in the conservatory in Geneva, in Switzerland. And so I had my first teacher there, and I spent like 8, 9 years with him. And he studied in Berkeley. He was a jazz drummer, so immediately showed me this way of playing, I guess. And he was also quite traditional in the way he was teaching. It was really like that first year, it's all about holding a stick and like reading music. He was immediately about reading, kind of almost in a classical way, those snare studies. So as an 8-year-old kid, I remember not really loving this because it was very strict in a way. But I was immediately outside listening to, I would say probably the first thing I discovered was this kind of fusion of jazz and rock, and it was kind of like the big days of Steve Gadd and Dave Weckl, and so this was a big one, I guess, and spending all my time on drummersworld.com, and kind of like checking this out, I guess. Um, but yeah, it had like a jazz background to it because of my teacher, I would say. And then immediately getting to play with people, I guess I was also lucky that they had a program in Geneva where you could, at the AMR, which is a jazz club, I could immediately play with other kids and then other people. And so it very quickly turned into kind of like gigging, almost like having a few bands and being in a few projects where you rehearse every week and stuff. So yeah, the jazz thing was, of course, very important immediately, and it got even more strong when I moved to New York, of course. And then at that point, I was a Mark Juliana fanatic. And then Body, of course, was probably the band I was listening to the most. And in New York, kind of starting to, yeah, be interested in those styles of music that live in between stuff, I guess. Yeah. and Wayne Krantz at the 55 bar all the time. I went so many times, and I guess that was the style of music that I was into. It's still jazz, improvised music, but it was coming from maybe more groove based 16th note thing, and it kind of tied in with this kind of fusion interest I had as a kid. And then, but that's the thing that's funny to me is all that time I was still listening to Aphex Twin, and I was still listening to a lot of drum and bass, and I was a heavy Jojo Mayer fan also, and all those, basically all those drummers and bands that were kind of like doing stuff that exist in between styles. I guess it's still today something I'm really into. But and then you mentioned prog rock, which is funny because I never really checked out that kind of music. It came from the Tigran sound. It's come up backwards, and he's a massive Meshuggah fan, and so I guess a lot of his, kind of like a lot of his aesthetic was influenced by this. But I was learning about this aesthetic through his style. So basically, seeing Nate Wood play with Tigran and was kind of my first, let's say, yeah, exposure to this kind of playing. Let's say more prog rock influenced. But I never actually, still to this day, went fully into checking it out more. So there's a lot of bands I don't know about, or styles or things, but it's it was really through the Tigran window, I would say. Yeah.
That's funny. Tigran was my gateway drug to prog rock as well. I was speaking to Matt Halpern from Periphery earlier in the month, and I was telling him that I discovered them basically because I had gotten into Tigran with both Nate and you, and then somebody hipped me to Periphery and Tesseract, and I was like, oh yeah, this is just like a heavier version of what Tigran is already doing. But that was going to be a question of mine, was if you had any previous exposure to that way of organizing rhythm. And it sounds like you hadn't really, besides just having a good foundation in it. So the first time I saw a song like Entertain Me, it took a fair bit of practice to be able to hear the 4/4 and the counter rhythm at the same time. And of course, that's sort of the key element of gent or prog is these nested counter rhythms within counter rhythms, but then just 4/4 on top of everything. Did that come fairly easy to you, or was there a period where you had to dig super deep?
I mean, I was always into, let's say, odd rhythms. I think this also from before, I discovered Mark Juliana through Avishai Cohen, which was, at that point also like the Gently Disturbed trio album, which, I was a teenager when this came out, and that was a big thing. So I think I was immediately interested, probably also based on this fusion background of like playing in 5 and 7, those kind of like interest in odd numbers, I would say. Yeah. So it was always part of the things I was practicing. And I guess I also had a teacher a bit later in my life in Switzerland that was like more of a groove player and started showing me a lot of that stuff. And so I guess I was starting to practice odd meter also quite early. Before I moved to New York, I was already into it, at least in practice. But of course, it's in New York that this became more like a heavy diving into. I was, also studying with Ari Honig and his philosophy about displacement and over the bar line kind of thing. So, of course, it was not specifically gent or prog rock kind of patterns, but it was still this practice of basically doing the difference between the pulse you can feel inside and your body and what you're playing, whether it's a kick pattern that's really complicated and doesn't repeat itself, all that stuff was already a bit part of the things I was practicing, just because I guess we drummers like this. It's like a thing we get interested about, probably like other musicians get into scales and, improvising over crazy chords. So it was still part of my interests, I would say. And then, so it wasn't that. Also, I was a big fan of this piano player called Nick Berch. He was actually from Switzerland. And he is also a kind of important musician here who was working on those kind of like cyclical, repetitive music using kind of odd time, let's say, structures. And so, yeah, I was into it. I was really into it. So it didn't come. I didn't have to start from scratch, if that's the question. You know, but of course, I had the same feeling. I mean, I remember very clearly the first time I heard Red Hell, which is the album by Tigran with Nate. And so I remember listening to this and being like, what is this? Like, completely blown my mind. And so, of course, I did this thing of starting to practice it and trying to understand it and asking questions. And when I saw Nate, I would drill him with all that nerd questions. And, you know, I was quite into trying to so when when I could start playing with Tigran, I was not starting from scratch, let's say. Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't know that about your backstory, that you studied with Ari, but it fits. And I'm not sure how much of this is just osmosis and how much of it is other influences, but I feel like both you and Ari, in addition to playing interesting across the bar line stuff and this sort of like nested implied meter thing that's rampant throughout Tigran and prog rock, you and Ari also both have a real economy to what you play, where it's not overly ornamented. Everything is very clean and clear. And yeah, I'm curious about that. Is that something you thought about consciously, or what do you feel like you were checking out or absorbing that lends itself to that? Because it fits perfectly into Tigran's idiom. In a way, you feel like if the parts were busier or more complex, it wouldn't work as well. But it's like just simple enough that the idea gets across really well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never really thought about this, but I think it came from probably also from a sound thing. I remember talking about this with, I mean, of course, Mark Juliana, that I was going to see, like, basically any concert he would play in New York. I saw him. So basically, yeah, Nate and Mark were, you know, I would really, anything they would play, I would be there sitting at the front row, kind of. And so I have a feeling that I also absorbed this kind of like, it's a sound aesthetic also. It's like kind of dead drums or lower pitched drums, kind of short staccato kind of thing. And I think this also, a lot of people sometimes they think that precision is all technique, but it's all, of course it's technique and pulse and hearing, but it's also choice of sound, I think, you know, and not necessarily tuning, but the way you hit the drums and the volume and all that stuff. So I have a feeling I was, and of course this influence then at the same time, the fact that I was really into very metronomic kind of like electronic influenced kind of drumming, you know, the Anthony Parks and Jojo Mayer. And I guess I was listening to this and being inspired by this way that you try to sound as clean as possible, in a way, as clear. And I think with time this refined, and maybe it's what you mean, that is at the end you play maybe less notes, it's less ghost note based in a way, but it has this kind of impact where you try to hit the same kind of velocity. It's almost like you have to think about it as a MIDI note. You try to hit the same kind of velocity throughout, and that makes the sound in a way. So I was more thinking in that way about sound based textures. Yeah.
I have this loose idea of kind of like the 55 bar family tree in my head, and I see Keith Carlock kind of as the grandfather, where you would see him play and there was this wonderful combination of really clean drum sounds, but also a lot of wash and sustain, right? Like he liked to just hammer ride cymbals. And I hear a lot of that in Nate's playing. And one of my favorite things that Nate will do is like intentionally create muddy sounds, playing the floor tom and the ride cymbal at the same time, and just create these really interesting textural elements. And I saw Juliana as taking some of that Carlock style and going to the really staccato end of things, like with these splash cymbal stacks. Like, how absurd can we go with the lack of sustain? And it's interesting to think about because I do feel like your style, and obviously there are a bunch of other influences, but if you think about the sort of New York jazz in the 2000s, early 20 teens DNA, it did feel like you were like the next generation of taking all those textural elements that those guys had created and then incorporating them. And you said you think very deliberately about sound, and I definitely noticed that when I would check out your live recordings with Tigran, and then like some of the Meinl playthroughs, and shout out to the Meinl folks. It felt like your sort of style you were developing was a perfect match for those sort of white noisy, like acoustic, electronica imitating acoustic sounds that Mino was producing. And I used to listen to like Out of the Grid and Entertain Me over and over again, just to kind of absorb the different textures you were creating. Like, here's a snare with like a longer sustaining stack. Here's a kick drum with a short sustaining stack. And it's still like a long-term goal of mine to somewhat approach that sort of textural vocabulary. I guess if there's a question here, it's just, well, maybe something interesting to delve into would be like, how has that changed over the years? Yeah, like from the time you first started experimenting in that way, like what do you think is the biggest thing that's changed about the aesthetics in terms of the sounds you like to get nowadays?
So first of all, I just want to go a bit. I also want to add in the equation Zach Danziger, who
Oh
would be
yeah,
maybe like
shout
the
outs.
godfather somehow in this kind of like. And actually, we talked about this with Nate a few times. How when Kranz is at the, a non-drummer is at the as the center of this kind of like constellation. So I know, so
Godfather.
his way of playing the guitar kind of influenced everyone else in a way. So for sure, that was important for me to mention it. And the Mino thing, it was, I remember very clearly going there right before I started playing with Tigran. It was really like the first time I could visit the factory in Germany. Was it the first time? Maybe no. I think it was the second time. But I really did the effort to go there and say, I actually need new cymbals. I'm going to be playing with this guy. It's kind of new. uh, Nate was using this kind of sounds, but this could work. And I remember clearly talking about it with Tigran. He had like an opinion about cymbals. He was really like, and he clarified this. He had a bit this, yeah, the very short sound is very important. So we need a few versions of this. So the hi-hat, of course, the close hi-hat, but it can be versions of open hi-hats, how open. And this still to this day, we talk about this. Like right after a show, he might say, this was a bit too open. It could be, 20% less open on that section, but on that other section, it should be really splashy and washy. So it's really, he has like a really strong understanding of the variety of cymbal sounds. So for sure, the hi-hat, but then the stack, the small one, and then the bigger one, of course, to have like some sustain, but not too much. And then the two other washy cymbals. So it was really kind of almost his idea to kind of this mix of sound, and so I went there and I told Norbert, I was like, I need that kind of stuff. So we figured it out together. So it's funny that those cymbals ended up being the exact same ones we played on Rockroot and all that stuff, but it's funny that I think Meinl was also kind of at the center of this stack thing. Yeah, but you were saying about how it changed. I mean, the more I get into kind of trying to record drums and be more on the production seat and trying to blend, because my main project these days is this solo electronic music where I play drums, but I still have in my head this clear idea that it should be felt as all electronic. It should be felt as like a mix of all those stuff. And I have to be playing like a drum machine a bit because I also have a drum machine playing at the same time, and so everything needs to match. So I have a feeling I got even one step even further into this, trying to understand the problem of sustain, the problem of a sound that's too long, and how this can create yeah, mud in the sound, specifically when you play in really high volume situations. And so I would say this, yeah, I started playing more and more using different kind of sticks, more playing more with mallets, having drums that are way dead, trying to find cymbal sounds that, yeah, that I can really control even more. So I have a feeling these days I'm more interested in this. How can I make this acoustic floor tom sound almost as if it's a kick drum from an electronic drum machine? And same with the cymbals. And so that means more kind of extended techniques research, whether it's different kind of sticks, the mallets, the thin sticks, those nano sticks we just released, and all that stuff kind of helped me getting kind of closer to a perfect mix between those sounds. Yeah.
That's really interesting. You mentioned that Tigran had a lot of input into the textures you were getting during the songs. And that brings up a question that I've wondered about for a while, which is how set in stone were the drum parts on some of those songs? Like I've heard them on the album and I've heard live versions, but did you guys discuss like, okay, here's what needs to be basically the same every time we play it, and here are the spots where you can improvise?
Yeah, that's basically it. It's pretty strict, I would say. It's more strict than loose. That means um, it's pretty, yeah, because a lot, I think it's based on the way the songs are written. I mean, it's very strict on himself on the piano part. I mean, the piano parts are incredibly complicated. I mean, so a lot of people focus a lot on those drums because you hear the big gestures, the kicks and the snares and the crashes, but actually almost the whole drum part is included in his left hand sometimes. Whether the low note is a kick and whatever is the high part of the pattern is a snare. And I think for him, it's not possible that section of that one song is different. You can't invert the kick snare patterns. So this is kind of like composed, yeah. And then all the cymbals, this is where it gets, I guess, looser. Like, of course, we are talking almost more about density. This is a very busy moment where a lot of notes, a lot of short sound, and then maybe this one is like wide open and it's only big washy sounds. So its density is very, let's say, set in stone. But like you said, there's also those moments where little sections of parts of songs or even full solos that are completely improvised on the spot. So it's pretty organized, I would say.
Yeah, I've always wondered that. What would you say to a drummer who hears the type of stuff you're doing and attempts to do it and hears themselves back on the recording and realizes they don't have the subdivision precision that's necessary to lock up with everything? Is there anything specific you practiced to develop that type of precision to lock up with drum machines and just have all your subdivisions really quantized?
I would say the biggest thing is I think a lot of drummers or a lot of drum methods are based on playing everything. I mean, it's the simple thing of like you have a drum book and maybe you have to play paradiddles and do accents and whatever, all that stuff, and it's great for the technique. But I think my assumption is like this doesn't help with the tightness, the hearing, because actually to get better at playing tight, you should train how to play less. You should, kind of like, and we usually do this when I spend time with students trying to think about those topics. It's actually, if you want to get good at those fives and whatever, you should practice kind of like hearing the fives and playing all the subdivisions without your hands doing everything. So it's a lot of like training the pulse, the inner pulse. So it is using your voice. I'm really a big believer in counting out loud or singing patterns, singing, just vocalizing patterns, and just being really good at basically hearing something in your body and being able to play something that's not exactly the same. And that means probably play less. And sometimes for a lot of people, they can play really complex things. But if you ask them to really hit that second 16th note, it gets really hard to just play that note at different tempos. So it's actually the basics of not forgetting to kind of practice playing very simple patterns, but where you are really hearing all the subdivisions and only choosing which ones you play. Yeah.
I like that a lot. Question from the complete other end. What's your favorite way to help integrate somebody into improvising? Like, say, if somebody's been practicing a bunch of source material like rudiments and ways to move around the kit, but there's a missing step between that vocabulary and it coming out in their playing.
Yeah, it's the practice, the improvisation. I have a feeling it's allowing. It's pretty similar as like meditation or something like that's closer to let go. This idea of being present without judging yourself on the spot and that stuff. So there's a lot of like very simple exercises. Like I think is it not even in a book? Like is it the Bob Moses book? Is it like a famous book where he talks about this kind of flow state, this kind of idea also about just playing very simple things, but not kind of like deciding. I think there's one exercise where he's playing just subdivisions and then accents, with the kick and in a cymbal or whatever. And that simple thing of trying to be on the moment, able to kind of like let go of this kind of judgment. So it's very abstract, of course, but it's this idea of like getting used to just playing freely without kind of judging yourself. And sometimes I also try to get people to think very quickly about structures, like really forms, and trying to improvise a little thing that could be an A part, and be really conscious when you improvise it to also hear it, to be like, oh, I just improvised this little thing on the tom and whatever it is, but being able to recognize what you just improvised and then put it in a context of a form where we should hear as a listener that this is the A part, and you repeat it and you develop it, and then you go to a B part, maybe that's completely different, and then you come back to the A part. And this, I think, draws the listener and makes it also kind of easier to improvise too, because the A part can be as simple. So I also try to do this with people when we talk about improvisation, to go with this kind of think more form than content. Yeah.
Do you think of it dualistically? Like there are modes in your practice when you kind of want the critical voice evaluating what you're doing. For instance, if you're practicing making your subdivisions more precise or something, and then there are other moments when you want to practice turning that editorial voice off as much as possible and just flowing.
Yeah, I tend to believe that it's important to, of course, the goal would be to kind of be able to do it all at the same time. But I remember for me personally, it was important during my practice to kind of like be specific when you practice something, and that can be to be free, but to really kind of like not try to constantly be in this performance mode. I think this can hurt. And of course, in a lesson, it's always difficult because you are performing in a way, you're in front of someone. But when you practice by yourself, this idea of being like, now for 20 minutes, it will not be music. It's just going to be, technical stuff. And this, I think, is totally fine if it's conscious. It's a bit less good when you start mixing and not really knowing where you're standing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Well, where would you send people to check out what you've got going on?
I mean, I think my Instagram page is probably what is the most kind of like say current, just because in the last, I would say the last 3 years, and of course the pandemic has also kind of rush this a bit faster even. It's like I've been so focused on this kind of electronic music, whatever that means. Sometimes it's collaborations with other people, sometimes it's really focused on drums and acoustic performance, but sometimes it's the opposite. It's fully drum machines and bunch of things and equipment based, let's say, practice. But it's kind of there that I share the most up to date and mostly that stuff that I'm doing these days, which is a bit more personal, and it's a bit further away from this Tigran aesthetic. But yeah, I mean, I released a lot of music actually the last 3 years. So there's a lot of Spotify things that sometimes don't even have drums on it, and sometimes are very drum focused. But yeah, I would say that's what's close to my heart at the moment. It's all that music I've been putting out and performing for the last 3 years. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, this has been great. Really appreciate your time. I know my audience will really enjoy hearing your insights about stuff. So big thanks for doing this interview.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks for the invitation.
You got it. Speak to you soon.